Thank you so much. Well, I remember when we were talking about this visit, and I didn't know it would be at such an opportune time. I'm glad for that. And I've been following with keen interest the Austin Institute and the good work that you're doing here. It's so needed. And I was the first employee of the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton, which is kind of like the mothership for a number of spin-off groups like this one. And so I'm just so glad to have something this good, this close by. Let me just start out by saying that before I get to the Angola study, which is what I primarily want to talk about because it represents the best research we've been able to do on prisoners, I wanted to kind of give you back up and indicate what kinds of research led us there in the first place. And so over the last 20 plus years, I have been interested in studying how religion can protect people from harmful outcomes. And then once people find themselves in predicaments, how might religion be able to help people turn their lives around? And so early on, I was introduced to Chuck Colson, and some of you are so young you probably won't even recognize the name Chuck Colson, but Chuck Colson was in the Nixon administration and was one of the Watergate figures that was convicted and served time in prison. And while he was in prison, he had a conversion, and then when he got out of prison, he started a ministry called Prison Fellowship. And this was all happening during the time that I was in graduate school. So when I got out of graduate school and started my own career, I thought I would love to be able to study prisoners that are going through a program like this one operated by Prison Fellowship, just to see if we could measure the impact of the program. And so I went to Washington and met with Chuck Colson and their staff and began doing research on Prison Fellowship, which is the largest prison ministry in the world. And so I've done many studies on Prison Fellowship. The first one that I did, I looked at the impact of Bible studies, if you can believe it, just Bible studies. Hour-long Bible study once a week to see if that might have an effect on a prisoner. And we did this in 3 different prisons in the state of New York. We looked at prisons where this program was in operation, and then we compared these to other prisons that did not have that kind of an intervention. So when I say intervention, that's the variable that we're looking at, this program called Bible studies. So as interventions go, this isn't much of one. An hour-long Bible study once a week, that's supposed to help people. But we found that, in fact, there was a significant relationship between participation in Bible studies, how often you attended Bible studies, and the likelihood that you would be rearrested once you got out of prison. And we did this for a follow-up period of a year when they got out of prison. We published that piece, and then there was a lot of interest in it. Could just a Bible study have that kind of an effect? So we did a follow-up study, and so for 3 years out of prison, it also maintained that effect, which is rather striking. And this is one example of how research can help us. I also evaluated 2 other programs by Prison Fellowship, and neither of them had an effect. One of them had kind of a negative effect. And my recommendation was to can the other 2 programs and emphasize everything in the Bible studies. But they, of course, didn't listen. They did all 3 of them, and then eventually the other 2 just faded away. But they did keep the Bible studies, and in fact, they thought if Bible study can help someone and it's just 1 hour a week and it's led by volunteers, what would happen if we could have a lot of Bible study going on every day? So they launched a faith-based prison in Houston, Texas in 1997, and they call this the Interchange Freedom Initiative. And so I launched a big study in 1997 of this particular program, and we found huge effects for people that participated. So half the prison was faith-based, and half the prison had what we call general population offenders. And the idea was if you could keep the faith-based side kind of quarantined from the general population, that it would have a positive effect. But what happened is the program took off in such a fashion that within a couple of months, there were all these undercover Bible studies going on in the general population, led by inmates in the faith-based side that were doing all this work. And then Chuck Colson in Prison Fellowship was afraid that the guys in the general pop would have a bad influence on the guys over here, and instead it was the opposite. And after a few years, the entire prison became a faith-based prison. And you may, stop me at any time. I know we're going to do Q&A, because you're going to say, how does a state prison become faith-based? Well, all the programs were paid for by Prison Fellowship. So no state dollars were used for the programs. And so that's how they got around any kind of legal issues. So the program was never challenged in court by any groups that might be opposed to faith-based groups. And so that was a pretty fascinating study that we did there, looking at a faith-based prison. And we have since done all kinds of studies on kids, on drug addicts, and we find similar kinds of effects. In fact, if one is raised in a religious home, it dramatically reduces the likelihood that kids will even experiment with drugs. This doesn't probably come as much of a surprise to you. One of the biggest studies that we did was in Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia, where we only looked at housing projects. And one of the highest risk groups is being young, poor, and black. So we looked at impoverished young black males in Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia with a huge N size. And what we found out is if they go to church, it dramatically changes the likelihood that they're going to get into any kind of trouble. And it has the opposite effect on prosocial things. It helps them do the right kinds of things if they're involved in church. So after doing all those studies and finding repeatedly these effects, there began to emerge a bigger literature. Because when I was in graduate school back in the Paleolithic era, there was no literature on this topic. So I didn't have studies that I could go read. We just started doing them. And so now, 25 odd years later, there's a very large literature that exists. So I'm one of hundreds of people that do studies like this, which is very exciting for me because I think faith is important, and the data seem to confirm that it's important no matter how we study it and no matter what group we study it with. That led us to get a phone call in 2012 from a guy in Louisiana whose accent was so strong I couldn't understand him. But he was the warden of a prison called Angola, otherwise known as the Louisiana State Penitentiary, widely recognized as the most violent prison in America, the most corrupt prison in America. The only difference between the correctional officers and the inmates is the way that they dress. So many drugs flowing into the prison, violence, staff on inmate, inmate on staff. Kind of a horrible situation located in a place in the middle of the bayous in Louisiana, not a destination job for anybody. So this warden gets this job in 1995 and realizes, what am I going to do? It's the largest maximum security prison in America, 6,300 prisoners. Just to help you understand, most maximum security prisons are very small because the security is so tight. So you might expect 1,000 inmates, not 6,300. So it's located on a plantation, what used to be a plantation, and the slaves from Angola, Africa, worked on this plantation. That's where the name comes from. So some tragic ironies throughout. And so we launched in 2012 a 5-year study of this prison, and the reason why is the warden started a seminary. He knew he needed to do something different than what was happening, and they started this Bible college, and inmates started signing up to go through the Bible college, and the reports were that the prison had been transformed. Not just prisoners, the entire prison. No suicides, no homicides, violence, dramatically cut. And so the warden calls me, and I can kind of pick up every other word. And he basically says, you know, we don't get any respect, and can you help me understand why people don't respect what we're doing here? And because we've changed this place. And I said, well, warden, I'm afraid all you have is an anecdote. I haven't seen any data on the prison, so why would you expect that people would believe something if all you have is some testimonials? He goes, well, what do we need? I said, well, we need to do a powerful study that would take some time to answer the questions that people are going to be asking. And so, make a long story short, we got a major grant to do this study, and we basically lived there for a long time, hanging out in that prison all hours of the day and night, weekends, and which is what you kind of have to do if you really want to capture what's happening there. And what we were told is that the Bible College had changed everything. That's not at all what we found. What we found was that the Bible College had a goal of training people to become pastors. And you're going, okay, so they're serving life. And in Louisiana, not like Texas, in Louisiana, life means you're going to die in the prison. You don't get out. They don't have parole. So when you talk about criminal justice reform, one of the things that you want to talk about is how can you make sure that when people are better, we don't keep them locked up, for one. What would be the purpose in that? But in Louisiana, you know, it's a very punitive state, much more so than any other state in the U.S. There's one guy there, I think he has a sentence of like 992 years. I mean, really? You know, I guess we have maybe one or two people in the Bible that might come close to that. But at any rate, and there are plenty of people there that are serving life sentences because they committed a third felony. And so remember that, you won't remember, you're too young, but there was something called 3 strikes and you're out, which means you could get a life sentence. And so there's a guy serving life and his third offense was purse snatching. So if you do the math on what it costs to incarcerate someone, this certainly isn't helping taxpayers of Louisiana for a guy to serve life for snatching someone's purse. So we began the process of interviewing, in-depth interviews, which lasted an hour or two with these guys over time. We did surveys over time where we'd ask a series of questions, and then we would ask them again 6 months later just to see how they answered those same questions. And then we would ask them these questions again. And then we would look at reports coming out of the prison, which you might call official data. Are they getting in trouble? Are they missing, you know, classes? Are they missing work assignments, et cetera, to kind of get an idea of how they're doing there too. Fascinating project. And then, so now we come back to the pastors. Angola is the only prison in the U.S. where they have congregations. When I say congregations, I mean thriving congregations. So there are 29 congregations in the prison itself. And I wish I could show you here, but we're talking big buildings. And these guys, they meet. Now, there's not 29 buildings, there's like 8 buildings where they have space. And they literally have a seminary building that was all paid for with private donations, just like the churches were. They go to seminary, they get out, they begin to start congregations. They have entire staff. They have pastors, associate pastors, deacons, elders, and then like most congregations, they have ministries within the congregations. So they tithe. I mean, these guys make pennies per hour, but they tithe. And then they have benevolence ministries. They do counseling. About 3 inmates die per month. Who does the funerals? The inmate pastors. Who does the grief counseling? The inmates. So they have something called sidewalk counseling and death row counseling, because death row for the state of Louisiana is located right at that prison, Angola. By the way, a bunch of movies have been filmed there that you might know about. Dead Man Walking was one of the movies that was filmed there, and several others. to make a long story short, what we found there is inmates that go to the Bible college do better than anybody else, except for inmates who go to those congregations. If you don't go to the Bible college and you attend those congregations, that too seems to be very important. The real magic is if you go to that Bible college and you're involved in a congregation, the difference is pretty awesome. And so we talk about in criminology something called identity transformation. It's not a term that we coined, others have coined that term, about the prospect, can people really change their lives? Because there are plenty of scholars that would argue it is impossible. You are what you are. You may think that you can change, but you really can't. But we were able to document over time what we call identity transformation based on our surveys, based on the interviews, and based on the official data. That triangulation showed that these were, different people than they had been. We were able to use a lot of the ethnographic interviews and do content analysis to also hammer home that point. It was a labor-intensive project. Hanging around in prison all day long isn't a fun thing to do, but at times when you hear an inmate that's 80 some odd years old talk about the last 60 years incarcerated and he shares his story, you sit there and you say, I'm just so thankful to be able to hear this. It's pretty remarkable and tragic all at the same time. So that's the work that we've done at Angola. What's really interesting is that every time we were there, some new delegation from California or Wisconsin or New York was coming to see what it was that was happening. Because now, as we started publishing papers, which we don't do a project if we can't publish. We've probably published about 15 journal articles in addition to the book that highlight this. So now about 20 states have launched a Bible college within the prison. So that's kind of cool, but there's a real problem there, and the problem is that none of those states are going to allow them to do congregations. And you say, well, why wouldn't they? And the reason why is, in many prisons in the 1950s, there was something called the trustee system. The trustee system is where inmates actually help correctional officers supervise inmates. But there became such abuses of it. And inmates carrying guns and monitoring other inmates and harming other inmates. So all states outlawed the trustee system because it was used for corruption and abuse. And that same language prevents prisons from launching congregations because they argue that a pastor has authority over people in their parish. And so Louisiana, again, is different. They can do whatever they want because it's Louisiana, and you have wardens that you can't understand a thing they're saying that can get away with it. And so these other states are only launching seminaries, but they're not allowing these congregations. And we think that's where everything happens, within those congregations. And what we find among addicts is the same thing we found at Angola. Addicts can become sober, not just if they find faith. It's important, but it's not enough. They relapse over and over again. They don't want to, but they do. But once addicts begin to serve other addicts, once they begin to give their lives away in service to others, they find their life. And that's what we saw at Angola. Once these inmates begin to focus on other inmates and helping other inmates, they get a new identity that allows themselves to reconcile their horrible past. And so I think those are some of the things that we found that are really important. There are all kinds of implications for criminal justice reform and what we should be thinking about based on those findings. And we can have a good conversation about that. I think I'm close to 20 minutes, so maybe this would be a good time to kind of break, Kevin. And then have they eaten yet?
No, they're going to be bringing everything. There was a slight appetizers and the entrees will all be coming out at the same time, and they'll all come out soon.
Great, great. Well,
until then, I was going to ask, since we're working together at the
yeah.
Austin Institute.
Yeah, can I tell about the other?
Yeah, can you
sure.
Just a few minutes talking
So,
about what we're working on now?
Yeah. So we were asked to do a study for Prison Fellowship International. I told you about Prison Fellowship US. Well, Prison Fellowship International is a newer organization based on the same premise that offenders can be transformed. So it's spreading like wildfire all over the world. Hundreds of places have these programs that are faith-based, and they asked us if we would do a study, and that study is anchored here at the Austin Institute. And so we started out with 3 sites: Nigeria, South Africa, and Colombia, South America. Nigeria was picked because it would largely be a Muslim population, and there are next to no studies looking at Islam, which is tragic because everywhere I go, people ask me, so tell me about the sample. And the sample tends to be Christian. And people want to know about the influence of Islam. And so I always say it's an empirical question. I wish we could answer it. Love to do that study. And the Nigerian government did approve our research plan, but once we got to Africa, they pulled the plugs on it. So we had to double our sites in South Africa, where we're looking at men and women that are incarcerated that go through a program called the Prisoner's Journey, which is like an 8-week-long curriculum that they can sign up for. And we're doing the same thing in Colombia, South America. It's been a fascinating project, nothing easy about it. I'll give you a couple of stories. Have you heard of Pablo Escobar? Okay, so one of the sites is where he was incarcerated, so that's really fun. But it's not located at the end of the world, but you can see it from there. So we're looking, again, we have the experimental, that's the prison that's getting the intervention, and then we find another prison, same custody level, same size, same area, region, but no intervention, to see if we can kind of document effects of these programs. So the prison next to Pablo Escobar's mansion, if you don't know, he was a drug kingpin, and he decided they couldn't get to him because he had more power and more protection than the government had. But he finally decided, okay, I will serve time, but if you let me build my own prison, which is a mansion. And the plane that he flew in, or his people flew and smuggled drugs, the plane is like up on this stand, so it's odd. You come in, and he built a zoo, so he loved animals, and so when we go there, we get to see hippos and rhinos and everything else. But it's a 4-hour drive from one location to the other, but it's only 70 miles. And it's up and down and up and down, and you can't pass, and there's so much unrest there. So we were afraid we might get kidnapped because we did kind of stand out. And they said, now, we hope if we time it right, we shouldn't have any issues with guerrillas trying to kidnap us or block the traffic. And we said, okay. So we're gassing up in this SUV to make this 4-hour trek, and all of a sudden, our SUV is just shaking like this. And I thought, what's going on? And I look out, and there's a guy jumping up and down on the SUV, and I'm just thinking, okay. And he was trying to shake it so the gas would fill all the way up. There would be nothing left but just a full tank of gas so we could make it all the way without stopping. Of course, we thought maybe the guerrillas had already found us at the gas station before we even got started. But one of the things that you find in the developing world is there are just so many problems that we don't expect in terms of doing our research and collecting data. So it's been a struggle, but it's also been an awful lot of fun. We've expanded, Kevin, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this to you, but we keep adding prisons in South Africa because the data that we're not getting a big enough N size in some of the prisons, so we're adding new prisons because for statistical power we need others. So we keep adding these prisons in South Africa, and they're having issues in South Africa too. These are post-apartheid issues that are very difficult. It's a real struggle, and so at any rate, this is a study that has another couple of years left. We're hopeful, and PFI is hopeful, that we'll find results that are encouraging as they expand throughout Europe and other places. But the honest truth is, we don't know what we're going to find. If the results are not good, you know, I'll be disappointed, but that's exactly what we're going to report. And it doesn't mean that faith doesn't work. It might mean that this program isn't the best program. But that's what we want to do as scholars, is do the best research we can possibly do. And if the program is working, you know, how could you even tweak it more? One of my big concerns is that most of the groups that you've heard about, the Salvation Army, Compassion International, World Vision, there's no research on these groups, next to none. And Compassion International does $1 billion a year in revenue, but they don't have research. And as a person of faith, this really strikes me as odd stewardship. It's not that World Vision doesn't do good work, but how do we know that they are doing good work? And so I think that we need a lot of work in the area of faith-based organizations and groups that are interested in showing compassion. What if we found that they were actually causing harm? And you know, I think that's, candidly, I think that's why some of them haven't done research. Is why would we want to do it? You know, we're getting plenty of support for what we're doing. And I think Prison Fellowship had they were thinking, we know we're having an effect. And of course we had to discipline them because they thought everyone that went through the program would be fixed. And we told them, no program fixes everybody. But at any rate, so maybe one of these days in the not too distant future, we can come back and give you an update on this PFI study. You know, does it work in Colombia but not work in South Africa? Or does it work among women but not among men? That's a fascinating question because almost all the studies on offenders are of men. But we know from many decades of research that women are more religious than men. Doesn't matter the religion, and it doesn't matter the jurisdiction. Women are just more religious, more spiritual than are men. And so then the question becomes, are women more likely to respond to faith-based programs than men? I would suspect so, but we haven't done a study where we straight out look for that. And so that's another thing that we hope to find with the research that we're doing in South Africa. Great, thank you.